All right, it's my pleasure to introduce James. He helped establish hundreds of fruit and nut trees on Orcas Island and operates as a landscape contractor with his business orchards, gardens, and irrigation. He and his family have vegetable gardens, fruit trees, and keep bees and chickens on their property. James is going to describe obstacles and local tricks for solving existing fruit and nut tree problems and establishing new orchards. Topics will include site and varietal selection, establishment secrets, pest and disease challenges, grafting to change varieties and improve pollination, stimulating growth on lackluster trees, and controlling excessive growth on vigorous trees. And James he will entertain questions throughout. So I will have the microphone and bring the questions to you instead of at the end. And that will help some of us who forget our questions by the end anyway. So with no further ado, here's James.
Hello, everybody. Well, great. Well, so if you're at this presentation, I figured you're probably in one of three categories. One is that you either are looking to plant new fruit trees and you want to do it successfully. Another category you might be in is that you have lackluster trees, whether they're not growing vigorously or whether they're not fruiting like you'd want. And you want to know how to pump up your lackluster trees. Or you're in the third category, which is your fruit trees are overly vigorous and they're producing too much fruit of one type of, too much of one type of fruit. You're overwhelmed. Maybe it's a mediocre variety. So we're going to talk about things to do for all three of these categories. And yeah, jump in with questions as we go. We'll keep it informal. So the main theme of this presentation is to be bold. Like everything you do with your fruit trees, I want you to be really bold. And being bold is what's going to get you the results you want in any of these categories we're trying to address. And so we're going to start by talking about establishing new trees and how we can be bold in establishing new trees. And let's see what the next slide is here. Oh, here, or go back. There you go. Okay, so establishing new trees. So a lot of times I help people plant orchards and landscapes, and everybody asks me like, how long till my fruit tree is making fruit? And it's just the classic, it depends kind of answer, because it totally depends on how fast your tree grows. Because you can have a 10-year-old fruit tree that's limping along in a hayfield that's, 8 feet tall 10 years later, and it's just spitting out a handful of fruit. Or you can have a 4-year-old tree that's got a nice thick trunk and is cranking out fruit. And so it's really not a question of how long, but how you take care of it. And for establishing new trees, which we're going to talk about right now, it's all about prepping 1 year in advance. And so people say, oh, you're prepping a year in advance. I want to plant the trees now so I can start getting the fruit now. And I say, no, if you prep a year in advance and do your homework, that tree is going to come into production so much sooner than a tree you're rushing into the ground. Imagine this is the alternative to buying a bare root tree at a nursery in the spring, running home with it and hacking out wet sod, trying to rush to get that tree in the ground. I don't know, have any of you ever been in that situation where you're rushing a tree into the ground? Yeah. And you're hacking out the sod and you're losing all your topsoil when you're hacking that grass out. So by prepping it a year in advance, what I love to do is essentially what gardeners call, sheet mulching or lasagna gardening. But basically where your fruit tree is going to be, dump some fertilizer, some soil amendment, some compost, lots of good stuff, and then smother it with a nice thick layer of wood chips. Smother it deep enough that it's actually going to kill the grass. And in that way, like I know all you have mulched with wood chips before, I'm sure, you're letting the worms and the microbes decompose the sod, and you're retaining all that topsoil that you'd normally be digging out if you're digging the grass out in the spring. So you mulch it out in advance. Let the microbes do the heavy lifting. And then I'd also recommend, and go bold, you know, the theme here is to be bold. Go bold with your ring, you know. These are some trees in my yard from a couple years ago, and you can see the mulch rings I initially had on them. They're pretty big, honking mulch rings for little trees. So go big, and it's better to have 3 trees that are well taken care of than 10 trees that are mediocre, you know, you do a mediocre job with. I'd also recommend setting up your drip irrigation plan in that year in advance, because you throw a tree in the ground and get one of those dry springs and you're like, oh God, irrigating. It's all about automatic irrigation, and it doesn't have to be a fancy system, you know, it could just be a battery timer to a drip line. But basically automatic drip is the key for a tree growing fast, because uh, during the growing season, if you can keep the soil moisture nice and moist, not too wet, not too dry, nice and moist through the growing season, vegetative growth just goes boom, 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 you know, grows, 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 grows. And if you're hand watering, and if you're not doing unless you're a really dedicated hand waterer, um, you know, there's going to be periods where it goes into drought. You're like, oh no, the soil's really dry, especially in clay soil. Once it's dry, it's like rock hard. You all know about that. And when a young tree goes into that drought cycle in the summer, it just stops its vegetative growth. It says, okay, you know, we're to the dry season. I better stop growing and hunker down and conserve. And so by having drip irrigation, we can keep that tree growing. So then you do all this prep work the year in advance, you mulch it out, and I say a year, it could be half a year, you know, it could be the summer before the next spring. It doesn't have to be exactly a year, but essentially long enough that you can mulch out the grass in advance. And then in the spring, you get your bare root tree, and rather than getting into that wet soil and hacking out all the sod, you can just rake back the mulch and dig a small hole just big enough for the roots and pop the tree in and have your irrigation ready to go. And that tree's going to grow like crazy. So here, click to the next slide. So these are the same trees, I think 3 years later. So, you know, had irrigation, they're growing like crazy, they're making lots of fruit. So this is like when people say, how long till it gets fruiting? 3 years if you do a good job like this. And yeah, in these early years, you know, it's all about keeping that vegetative growth up. You don't want it to start making too much fruit too early. Man, I know probably you have all seen a young tree that bears too much fruit and it bends the branches down and deforms the branches. So it's all about, you want to pick that fruit off a young tree. I mean, you can leave a couple fruits in, you know, the central area of the tree, but if you start having a branch that's bending down on a young tree, you know, you want that branch to go up. You don't want that branch to bend to the ground with too many apples on it. So thin that fruit off young trees, keep fertilizing it, mulching it, irrigating it, keep grass at bay. Grass is the great competitor to a fruit tree, both for moisture and nutrients. And you'll have fruit early. Yeah, yeah. It really, yeah, anything that's high in organic material and nutrient that's going to smother the grass, that's going to do a great job. Yeah, use a cow or horse manure. Yeah, horse, that's going to add nitrogen to the soil. It's going to add a lot of organic material to the soil. So yeah, if you got a bunch of compost, yeah, put that down. Really, again, the theme of this presentation is be bold. So if you think it's going to help, go for it and do a lot of it, because the more the better, really, when it comes to organic material with a tree. So now I want to talk about some diseases that we need to be vigilant with young trees. So let's jump to the next slide. Actually, let's see. Are we talking? Maybe we're talking pruning here next. Okay, yeah, we're going to talk pruning. So here's an old tree. It's got a nice scaffold, a nice shape. How do we get your little tree that comes from the nursery to look like that? And this is where, again, we got to be bold. And when your tree comes from the nursery, your tendency is not to want to do anything to it because it's, you know, a little baby. But this is where we've got to give it its boldest pruning of its life. And it's the most important pruning you do on a fruit tree is in its first couple years. So when we get a tree from the nursery, here, let's click to the next slide. Yeah, okay, so this is what, you buy a tree from a nursery, this is what it looks like, right? It's got a lot of branching. Um, and, the tendency is not to want to do anything to it, but we got to think about what we want the final height of this tree to be. And it totally depends. And the first question is it in an area that's deer fenced or not deer fenced? If it's in an area that's deer fenced, you can have it be branching lower to the ground because we don't need to get it above deer browse. If it's outside of deer fence and we're caging it for its first couple years, obviously we're gonna have to get that branching up high enough that it's gonna be above deer browse. Also, we want to think about how you mow. Do you mow with a push mower, a weed whacker in your orchard, or do you mow with a riding mower or a tractor mower? And the larger the mowing device you're on, the higher up you're going to need this tree branching. So let's click to the next slide. Let's see what the next slide is here. Okay, so we're going to do 3 slides here. This is some very technical scientific drawings here. But of what you're going to do when you get this tree from the nursery. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to decide how high we want this initial branching. So if it's got really low branches, we don't want those to become low branches eventually. So this first slide is, let's say it's in my little backyard, it's deer fenced, I want a nice low branching tree. I'm going to pick, 3, 4 of those kind of branches that came from the nursery, kind of go radiate in nice directions, and I'm going to thin out the rest and head those back to promote branching. And let's click to the next slide. So maybe we have a tree that, we ride under with a riding mower. We'll select some of the higher up branches to move that tree up for higher branching. And let's click to the third slide here. Or maybe you've got a tree that's outside of deer fence and you want it to be, branching at like head height. What we're going to want to do is we're going to go and we're going to cut off all the branches that came from the nursery and head it off the top to encourage new branching up high. So don't be afraid when you get a tree from the nursery to even turn it entirely into a whip to get it branching higher up. Because essentially, if we allow those lower branches to grow, someday you're going to have to prune them off. And you might as well have taken all that energy the tree put into those low branches and put it into higher branches. And this is something we'll cover a little later, but essentially when a tree is dormant, if we prune it when it's dormant, like coming out of the nursery or coming out of winter, we're stimulating it because its energy is in its roots. So even if we cut off all the branches that are on the tree, we're not like taking energy away from the tree. We're just choosing where it's putting that energy when it wakes up again. So yeah, you can take a tree out of a nursery and turn it straight into a whip. And the thing you'll need to do though is if, let's say, yeah, you have this little tree from the nursery, you cut off all the little branches and you say, I want you to branch up here. What's important is after you do that pruning and then it starts to grow again in the season is it's going to try and resprout where you cut it. And I'm sure many of you know this, like where you cut a tree, it starts resprouting again. So what you're going to want to do is if you've decided to get it to branch up here, you want it to not make new branches down low. So you're going to rub off any sprouts that are growing in the places you pruned off and really say, put all the growth into the area I want. So be bold. Yeah, the first prune of a fruit tree's life is the most important pruning it's got. A lot of times when I go to prune fruit trees for people, they haven't pruned it out of the nursery for 6 years or something, and you've got to go and do a major kind of hacksaw job to get it into the branch formation that you want. So instead of hiring somebody to butcher it in 6 years, just do it from the beginning. Okay, now we're gonna jump into diseases. Here, let's click one more slide. Okay, so does anybody know what this disease is? Deer, exactly. This is the leaving the gate open disease. Don't let deer eat your young fruit trees or ruin your young fruit trees. That's the worst. There's nothing more tragic than you've done your bold amount of prep for a year. You've got this tree, it's looking so good, and then comes fall and a buck just destroys it. So either keep your gate closed if it's in the deer fence, or if you're gonna do a tree cage, do a really good tree cage because a flimsy tree cage they'll push right over. So again, if we're gonna be bold in your tree cage. That's the number one thing to avoid. Okay, let's click, okay. Let them tree, well, once it's a big tree, they're actually kind of handy. They prune all the low branches, which makes it easy to mow under, but you don't want them to trim it for you when it's little. The second most, this is not a slide of it, but the second disease I'd say watch out for is your weed whacker on a young tree. Yeah, has anybody ever girdled a young fruit tree with a weed whacker before? No? Oh, good job. Nice. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, if you weed whack a young tree, you can girdle it like that because that weed whip kind of whips around it. So even more reason to maintain a nice big mulch ring around a young tree is keeping the grass away so you're not tempted to weed whack close to the tree. This is the main disease we need to worry about with apples. Anybody recognize this disease? This is called apple anthracnose. And essentially, in the San Juan Islands, all old apple trees have apple anthracnose. I mean, some maybe don't have it, but typically I see on old trees, either they have it and it's mild, if it's a healthy tree, or if it's an unhealthy tree, they have it really significantly. And once a tree is up to a certain size, it's not the end of the world. It's gonna get it eventually, but on a young fruit tree, these lesions, you can click to the next slide here too.
Are you interested in this? Lee?
I think we got one more anthracnose slide. Yeah, so you can kind of see, yeah, these are all lesions, and it's this classic kind of bullseye lesion. And on an established tree, if some percentage of your branches have these lesions on them, it's not a big deal. But on a young tree, which is essentially like one small branch for its first couple of years, you get a bunch of these lesions on the tree, and it's kind of like it's going to have a really hard time growing out of it, and sometimes it will kill it. So my main recommendation with apple anthracnose is don't plant young apple trees right near old apple trees. So if you got like big heritage old apple tree in your yard, my recommendation would be if you want to plant fruit trees near it, plant something other than an apple. Because anthracnose here, at least, there's lots of different anthracnoses in the plant kingdom, but the apple anthracnose we deal with only affects apples here in the San Juans. And then really vigilant monitoring is the other thing I'd recommend is keep an eye out for these lesions. You can back up maybe one slide here. Yeah, essentially, if you start to see weird things on your bark, you could idea with somebody on the island who knows what apple anthracnose is, can send them a picture and say, hey, is this apple anthracnose? Or look at pictures online. There's some pretty like telltale signs of it, and you can prune it out. Yeah.
That become a fairy house?
Yeah, I guess it could. Did you say a fairy house? Yeah, I know, I guess, yeah, fairies probably live in those legions, you're right. So we'll don't cut them out because we don't want to cut the fairies out. But if you don't have fairies, then I would say prune them out and monitor for new ones. And if you get a young tree that has a bunch of, like sometimes a young tree, for whatever reason, you'll look one year and it has like 12 lesions just going up its trunk. I'd say don't be afraid to rip it out and just start over. Because it seems that some varieties of apples are more sensitive to it. And sometimes if a tree's just stressed for whatever reason, it's going to get it worse than other trees. So typically healthier trees that are getting irrigation, fertilizer, and fertility fare better with all diseases than an unhealthy tree. So, and then another thing you can do, which I used to do more, and now I'm kind of like back and forth. It doesn't do anything, but spraying organic copper is a recommendation. In the winter, you can spray a couple times as a preventative. You can't spray it away once you have it, but you can potentially prevent spores from establishing with a copper spray. But again, there's some spraying that's on fruit trees that's really effective, like spraying for peach leaf curl is really a slam dunk effective thing to do. But copper for anthracnose, I can't say definitively whether it works or not. I waffle on it. Next disease we need to look out for on, this one. Do people recognize this disease? Do you have this on Lopez? Black knot, yeah. So black knot affects plums. Again, it's not the end of the world on an established tree. You have a big old plum tree and you're like, oh dang, there's like 10 black knots in it. You prune them out, you move on. But on a young tree, you don't want to get big black knot lesions establishing on a young tree. So be really vigilant for not letting a black knot start to establish on your young trees. And really pruning is the best method. Sometimes on a trunk where you can't prune the trunk off, essentially, I've experimented cutting out the lesion with a nice sharp knife. And it seems like it works. And then sometimes it grows back and you cut it out again. And but yeah, between either pruning off the branch or cutting it out, I just say keep black knot at bay. Let's see what's the next slide here. Yeah, more black knot. Okay, we'll pause here for a second. The fifth thing you need to worry about with young trees is voles. Do you guys have pretty bad voles on Lopez? Yeah, we have bad voles on Orchis too. And it can be brutal. I mean, I planted this one orchard some years ago, and I've seen trees with 8-inch diameter apple trees that I've been able to go and pull out of the ground because the voles have burrowed and eaten all their roots. And sometimes people say, oh, voles only girdle at the surface level, and if you put like a little collar around it, you'll be okay. But it seems like voles, if they want to, they go deep and they eat the roots. So if you have voles, if you want to plant fruit trees and you have like an old hayfield that's riddled with voles, essentially that's a bad start to planting trees. You're gonna have to do something to kind of get your voles in check, whether that's potentially, some tight mowing for a couple of years, some tillage, some cats, whatever it may be. You got to get your voles. If you just go and put a young fruit tree into a vole-ridden field, it's gonna be trouble. Yeah.
San Diego, what I've done is basically put a cage around the roots, like for my citrus trees. Is that something you can do up here with the?
I've tried it and I've had the voles climb into the cages, but my cage is only stuck out of the ground. This is like a gopher basket being described, so like you can make it out of a wire mesh that's small enough that they can't climb through. And this is in the ground. When you plant a new fruit tree, you're essentially planting it in a metal cage. That's what you're talking about. I only had the top of the cage sticking up maybe 3 inches above the soil. So perhaps if you had it sticking up higher, they wouldn't climb in. Oh, you closed it. Okay, that's smart. Yeah, close it. Okay, yeah, closing it on top. I guess that would be the way I would try it if I tried it again. The hassle of it was, all that wire above ground all of a sudden kind of becomes a weed and grass fortress. I don't know if that was your experience, but with mulching, yeah. So if you were gonna go into a heavily vole situation, I'd say, yeah, give those. You can find online, they're called like gopher baskets or mole baskets. Yeah.
In gardens especially, we have gophers and voles. We can trench and bury, 1 to 4 feet down.
Oh, wow.
All the way around, so they come and hit that wall, and they turn around.
That sounds effective. Yeah. If you have 4-foot trench, yeah, go for it. Especially, but hand dig only, right? You can't dig that with a machine. You gotta dig 4 feet by hand. Yeah, a hand dig only. Yeah. So voles are tough. And I don't have a silver bullet for voles, but you just gotta think about them. And it seems like mowing tight deters them. It doesn't like eliminate them, but it deters them. Shaggier grass along your fence line. So mowing tight helps. It's not a slam dunk answer, but it helps. Okay, so this is really, we kind of covered establishing new trees there. And again, we're bold with the establishment, we're bold with the irrigation, be bold with fertilizer, be bold with keeping an eye out for diseases and keeping your gate closed. Now let's move on to if you come here and you have fruit trees that are lackluster and what we do about lackluster fruit trees. So there's kind of like two categories of lackluster fruit trees. There's one is young trees that are lackluster. You planted a tree from the nursery and it's still only like 6 feet tall and it's full of like fruit spurs and it's not really growing and it's just making fruit, but it's not growing. Do people have fruit trees like that in their yard? Yeah. So that's kind of one type of tree we'll talk about. And then the other type of tree is like an older tree that has kind of faded out in its production. So first off, for a young tree, say you planted a tree 5 years ago and it's just creeping along. Maybe it's putting on this much active growth a year. What do we do? Well, first off is we hit it boldly with some TLC. Fertilize it aggressively, I'd say. Uh, when you're using organic fertilizers, I use organic fertilizers. Synthetic fertilizers are obviously a lot higher potency, so you gotta be careful with them. But when you're using an organic fertilizer, something where the number range is in like, 642, 555, 444, the nitrogen number, the first number is relatively low. It's hard to overdo it. It's, you hear about, oh, burning a plant with nitrogen. With an organic fertilizer, it's really hard to burn a plant. If you're using like a synthetic 40-40-40 lawn fertilizer, that's a different story. But organic fertilizers go big. I use a product called Perfect Blend. That's a 442. And I get 50-pound sacks of it. And, I'll put like on a young fruit tree that's been in the ground a couple years and it's just like stuck and it's not growing much. I might put 2 gallons of organic fertilizer dug into the ground around it, like half a 5-gallon bucket of pelletized organic fertilizer, really dig it in around around the drip ring, put some nice mulch on top of it, just really hit it with a big nitrogen punch. And that can really shock a tree out of being stunted into some vegetative growth. Because again, if we want a lot of fruit on a fruit tree, the fruit tree needs to be as big as possible to handle the amount of fruit we want. And so a little tree just can't carry a lot of fruit. So we've got to get more vegetative growth to get the tree bigger to handle the fruit load. And so nitrogen can help boost that vegetative growth. If you haven't been watering it, or you've been lacklusterly hand watering it, put it on some irrigation or become a vigilant hand waterer. So water, fertilizer, mulch, go big. And I'd say if doing a year of treatment like that, where you fertilize it and you mulch it and you irrigate it, and it still doesn't really start growing too much, this is where you've got to do what I call sink or swim pruning. And basically a tree sometimes, for whatever reason, it got stunted in its life, whether it was just lived in the nursery too long and it was kind of root bound in its nursery pot, or, it went through some stressor and didn't kind of come out of it. Sometimes fruit trees will just say, well, this is as big as I'm going to be. I might as well make as many babies as possible because, making fruit is their kind of reproduction strategy. And so they just hunker down and make fruit. But if we want to get them to grow again, we can do this thing called sink or swim pruning, where we essentially chop them really hard, go and cut off all the fruit spurs, chop branches back hard. And even sometimes to a fruit tree, I'll just go, if it's a really stunted little fruit tree, sometimes I'll even just chop it completely off at the stump at like 3 feet or something. And you say to it, you either grow, again, it's sink or swim. And first we've tried giving it some love, but it's sink or swim. A lot of times when you hit a tree hard like that and you remove all its fruit spurs, all of a sudden it says, okay, like, I'm a new thing. Let's grow, and you'll get phenomenal growth out of it. And then, you can guide that growth over the next couple of years back into a new tree. If you've given it all that love, irrigation, fertilizer, and you give it sink or swim treatment, you chop it hard, and it still only grows like this much, the tree's probably not going to do anything. It's time to either just give up on it and let it be, or replace it. Because it just seems sometimes trees just don't do it. And that's where, we get to the sink or swim. Yeah.
Caterpillars, when they attack the young trees.
They're brutal. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's the other one to watch out on young trees. Don't let your young trees have 10 caterpillars. Watch them vigilantly, pick off the nests when they're small, pick off the egg sacs in the winter. I'm sure most of you all know about that. On an old tree, if it's got 100 nests in it, it can be brutal. An old tree, if it's got like 6 nests in it, it's not the big end of the world, but 6 nests on a little tree, that tree's toast. So yeah, thank you. Watch out for 10 caterpillars. Okay, so little trees, lackluster little trees. We give them love, we give them sink or swim treatment. Basically, we want vegetative growth. We don't want just lots of fruiting on a stunted little tree. What about an older tree that is either slowed down in fruiting or it's too big, like you can't pick any of it. This is where we can do heavy pruning called dehorning on older trees. And this is an example of like an old orchard that was kind of dehorned, where you can imagine, you see the diameter of those branches. These were big trees that got chopped back really hard and are re-stimulating new vegetative growth. So let's say you have an old fruit tree that's like, you're like, I can't pick any of the fruit anymore. You can come and you can be bold. Again, the theme of the presentation here is be bold. You can prune that tree hard and it will, unless it's a peach tree, and we'll come to this again, unless it's a peach tree, don't do it to a peach tree. Most other fruit trees, you can chop so hard, re-stimulate vegetative growth, and in a couple years, have a nice fruit tree that's like fruiting at the height you'd like. Let's see what the next slide is here. Okay, so here's an example of some pear trees in a backyard, and you can kind of see the size of that trunk. These were like 20-foot tall pear trees, and I wanted to change them over to a new variety, topwork grafting them. And we'll talk about that a little more here. But you can see I essentially just chainsawed them off. I did it above deer browse, so if it's outside of the deer fence, make sure you're not chainsawing it down low where then it just becomes a deer snack. But I chainsawed it off at the height above deer browse, and you can see this is the first year after chainsawing. Got this big flush of growth, and you could either re-guide this growth into a new lower fruiting tree, or what I did is then I grafted new varieties onto these trees to change the variety of fruit over. So we got dehorning fruit trees. Another issue, so if you got a giant tree that's just too tall, don't be afraid to boldly chop it back. Sometimes if you're feeling nervous about it, you can leave like one big branch, like say chop 80% of the tree out. At the height you want it to start branching again, and leave one branch as just kind of like your insurance policy. And then the next year go and chop that branch out if you're feeling nervous about it. But essentially apples, plums, pears, not peaches, you can hit so hard and you'll be amazed at the results. Another issue you might have with a tree is it doesn't produce fruit. Say you've got a really healthy tree, a vigorous tree, and you're like, why doesn't it make fruit? Well, the first question I always ask people is, does it bloom? And if it blooms and doesn't make fruit, then we've got a pollination issue. If it doesn't bloom, which is rarer, it sometimes can be a younger tree of a certain variety, can take a couple years till it starts blooming. But also sometimes a tree that's just so overly vigorous doesn't bloom as much as you'd like, but that's a rare situation. Most of the time, when you don't have fruit on a fruit tree, it's blooming, but it's not getting pollinated. And you might be like, well, I'm sure most of you know, a lot of fruit trees, you need a pollinating pair for it. Like if you've got you need two apples of two different varieties. You need two pears of two different varieties. There are self-fertile fruit trees out there, like some peaches, nectarines, some plums are considered self-fertile, but most fruit trees either need a pollinator or do better with a pollinator. If you're like, hey, I've got two pear trees, why aren't they pollinating each other? Well, look at when they're blooming, because there's early pears and there's late pears, and there's early apples and there's late apples, and their bloom times might be off. So you might have two varieties. You might have like a really early apple that blooms a month before your late keeper apple is blooming. Yeah.
If you have a partridge.
You got a partridge in a pear tree. Let's see here. I would cut the branch the partridge is on to get it fall to the ground. And then do you eat partridges, or what do people do on Lopez? There you go. Nice. Okay, so you first off, you see if the tree's blooming. If it's blooming and you have a pollinator for it, that maybe it's not blooming at the same time, you need a pollinator for it. And there's two ways to do that. One, you can plant a new fruit tree as a pollinator. Another is you can graft in a pollinating variety into the same fruit tree. So are you all familiar with like how fruit trees are grafted? Like pretty much just a little step back here. So every fruit variety is a clone. that's been grafted onto a tree. So let's say, for example, like a frost peach. Frost peach is, every frost peach is essentially a clone of one selected peach once upon a time. And you take a piece of frost peach wood and you graft it onto a rootstock. It's called the rootstock variety, and that's how they make a fruit tree. So all fruit trees are a grafted tree. That said, there's some fruit trees that you can grow from seed, but most fruit trees are a grafted tree. And so you can graft other varieties into that tree too, if you'd like, have a tree that has multiple varieties in it. And sometimes you can buy those from the nursery, like a multi-graft variety, but you can actually do that later on too. Say you have a big tree, what you can do is you can do this hard kind of pruning on just part of the tree, chop part of it, get a nice stimulation of growth, and then you can graft a new variety into there. So you can graft a pollinator in, you can plant another pollinating tree, or a quick trick is you can say you have a pear tree that's in bloom, you can go over to your friend's house and they've got a different kind of pear tree in bloom. You say, hey, can I cut some of your branches? You can cut a bunch of their blooming branches, put them in a bucket of water and bring them back to your house and put it on a nice sunny day next to your tree and see if that pollinates it. So that's a quick trick. Let's see, what is the next slide here? Okay, yeah, this is just another picture. You can see, look at what a beefy trunk that was on this tree, right? You know, it was a giant pear tree, and you can see where I just chainsawed it off, and I got this huge flush of growth. And this was a couple years ago. I've since grafted these trees, and they're like now producing a nice crop of pears on a low branching tree. So, let's see, what's the next slide here? Okay, so oh yeah, here's a picture of topwork grafting. So here was an older tree that got chopped back hard, and you can see has been grafted to a new variety. And this tree has been completely regrafted. You can, if you like your variety, but you just want another variety, or you want a pollinator, you can just do that to like half or a quarter of the tree. You don't have to chop the whole tree back. Let's see here. Okay, so pruning wise, what was my next slide? Or oh, go back one, go back. There we go. Okay, yeah. Okay, so let's talk pruning here for a little bit. So pruning is one of those things where I feel like people get tripped up by rules they've heard about pruning. They either went to a pruning workshop, or they were pruning with their friend who knows how to prune, or you read a book about pruning and you like get these kind of rules stuck in your head. Like you're like, oh, I have to cut to the bud that's facing this way, or I can't have any branches crossing, or you know, there's like rules that get stuck in your head. And I would kind of encourage you, outside of the critical pruning of the first couple years of a fruit tree, this is talking about once it's more established, I would encourage you not to think about like how to prune that fruit tree and more about why you're pruning the fruit tree. And that I feel like guides you to easier, better pruning. And so if you think about why we're pruning the fruit tree, it's for picking the fruit. And so when you look at a tree and you say, this is a tree I want to pick the fruit off of, you think to yourself, how do I want to pick the fruit? Do I want to pick the fruit standing on the ground mostly? Do I not want to get on a ladder? That would guide how you prune it. Do I want to stand on a small ladder and pick the fruit? Or do I want the biggest possible tree and I want to be on a giant ladder and like 15 feet off the ground with a heavy basket of apples on me? That's not my cup of tea. But so yeah, think about how or why you want to prune the tree, and that will guide. So if you're trying to pick it all from the ground, when you go to prune it, you're like, well, I got to pick this tree this fall. I'm going to prune it such that I'm able to pick most of the fruit off the ground. Also, when you approach a tree to prune, if you have a hard time getting into there to even prune it, you've got to think fast forward to when I'm going to be picking this tree too. So it's like, I need to be able to prune to be able to pick. So you got to have like access into the tree, the ability to pick it. Because if you can't get in there to prune it, how are you going to get in there to thin it or get a tent caterpillar nest out of it? And then if you can't get in there to thin it or get a tent caterpillar nest out of it, how are you gonna get in there to pick it? So really like think about how do I want to pick it? How do I want to mow it? You know, do I want to be like playing limbo under a really low branch? And again, this is where you can be bold. You don't have to think about lots of rules and tricks, like really go into it with that bold thought of like, this tree is essentially my tree for me to pick and enjoy. How do I want it to be best suited to my enjoyment? And that's where you can like get in there and you have this big old grandpa branch down low that you're always playing limbo under, cut it off, you know, just chop it off. Or if it's too tall and you're just like, all that fruit is you know, I never get to that top fruit, especially if it's like a stone fruit or something where it's soft and you're not picking it off the ground, you know, cut that top out of it and, you know, just be bold and think, I'm pruning this tree for, yeah, for ease of use, essentially. Again, in the established tree pruning realm here, I have two kind of general mottos. I balance kind of the yin and the yang of pruning. First off, as I say to myself, when in doubt, cut it out. You know, like if you're hemming and hawing over a cut, just make the cut. You know, it's like, it's not worth hemming and hawing over. And sometimes when I'm pruning with somebody who's like new to pruning, or I'm teaching somebody to prune, I jokingly say, well, you know, like, what do you think about this branch? Should we cut it out or not? And I'm like, well, let's cut it out and see, you know, like, let's see what it looks like without it, you know? And it's true, because once it's gone, then you're like, ah, it's gone. And you're not like, oh, I wish it was back, you know? So yeah, when in doubt, cut it out. Now you gotta balance this with the other side of, you don't have to fix it all in 1 year. If you when in doubt, cut it out, the whole tree, all of a sudden you're gonna be like, oh, I just butchered that tree. So, you know, when in doubt, cut it out to a certain stopping point. And at a certain point, just walk away from the tree and tell yourself, I don't have to fix it all in 1 year. I've always got next year. Because yeah, it's not the end of the world. I mean, if you have some giant crazy branch that's going to break under a snow load, obviously you want to get that. But if you don't prune it all in 1 year, you can prune it next year. So good segue question here. So just a reminder here, when we're winter pruning, and this, when I'm describing these when in doubt, cut it out moves, these are winter pruning moves, dormant pruning moves. Dormant pruning stimulates a tree. Summer pruning suppresses and stunts the energy of a tree. So when we're worried about when it's a younger tree or a tree that we want to get bigger, we're dormant pruning because it's stimulating, because all the energy of a tree is essentially stored in its roots over the winter. And then in the spring, it comes out and pushes into the scaffold of the tree, and it fills in. It's like, okay, here's where I'm going to put all my solar panels. It fills in the tree. If you go and you chop out 50% of that tree, the energy still is going to come up and it's going to fill in solar panels where it is. And so, yeah, when we dormant prune, we're stimulating growth because we're removing material, and then new growth will fill in that space. So if we have way too tall of a tree and we chop out half of it, all that energy that was going to go into that giant tree is just going to come into our lower trees. So we don't worry so much about shocking a tree when we're dormant pruning. When you have an overly vigorous tree, like who has an Asian plum, like Asian plums are like the juice bomb plums. Who has an Asian plum that's absolutely bonkers? Do you have yeah, you got a bonkers. Sometimes they grow like, no exaggeration, 15 feet in a year. They can send out a shot of growth that by the end of the season is like this big around, and it's not just a whip, it's like a whole branch system that's got branching, and each branch on it is like 8 feet long. I don't know, is that like your Asian plum? Yeah, they're crazy. They can grow nuts. And that is a tree that if we just keep pruning it in the winter, we're just stimulating it. We're doing nothing to rein it in. And that's where then when you have an overly vigorous tree, we want a summer prune. And essentially when you prune in the summer, its energy's up in the tree and it's got all these solar panels out. If we go and we cut out a third of its branching in the summer, we're reducing what it's putting away for winter, and we're reining that tree in. And so especially if you have trees that you want to keep at a certain size, like whether they're planted close together or whether you're like, I don't want to get on the ladder to pick fruit. Once they're to the size we want, if they're still vigorous, that's where then we start employing summer pruning to keep their size under control. And that's where we do want to almost, did you say shock? What was the word you used? Yeah, we do almost want to shock the tree a little bit and say, hey, no, like, don't get big, stay here, stay here. And it's totally healthy and fine for the tree. It's not like we're gonna, summer pruning year after year is gonna kill it or something. You know, we're drastic cuts in the winter, more thinning in the summer. So yeah, again, if we're being bold with a tree with the goal of stimulating it to grow lower or rebooting it or for grafting, that's all dormant cuts. Yeah. Yeah. Not really. I just kind of like, again, I look at what my goal is and know that, say you had a giant apple tree and you chainsawed it off at 3 feet off the ground, it's going to explode with growth, most likely. You know, most of the time, it's going to explode with growth. And, or if you know, stumped it back to, if you go back a couple slides, or more, that one. So like these apple trees clearly were much larger because you can see by the trunk size. Somebody, when they chainsawed all these trees, instead of saying no more than 30%, they probably took out 95% of the growth of those trees and we're re-stimulating. So again, it's just kind of depends on what our goal is and how vigorous the tree is. If it's a really vigorous tree that's growing like crazy and I need to size control it, I'm going to prune out much more than 30%. If it's, you know, the perfect size and it's just cruising along nice, maybe we're only going to prune 5 or 10%. So again, this is not a how to prune trees, like rules for how to prune trees and why you're pruning the tree. And why is kind of a case by case basis of like, what is my goal with this tree? How big is it? How vigorous is it? How do I want to pick it? And so does that kind of answer that question? Yeah.
When you cut with the chainsaw, don't you want an angle? I see flat.
I've heard that.
Water.
I think it looks ugly. I mean, you're worried about water sitting on a tree. I mean, this tree is a living creature that lives outdoors all the time. And it's not like a fence post. So I'm not a subscriber to that. But again, there's no one answer in fruit. That'd be the other thing I might give here is there's no golden rule to anything when it comes to orcharding. You know, I'll tell you what I think. Somebody else will tell you what they think. Somebody else will tell you what they think. You'll start working on your trees and you'll develop your own theories. So, but when it comes to that, I don't worry about an angle cut. But yeah, let's see. Where's the question? Oh yeah. Essentially, once it's mostly dormant, so let's say a bulk of the leaves have fallen off up until it's really starting to leaf out and push growth. We don't want to prune it after it's all, like if we're doing dormant pruning, we don't want to do it after it's like flowered and it's starting to really shoot vegetative growth. That's too late for a big pruning if our goal is stimulation. And we don't want to do it too soon when it's still putting energy in to the ground or into the ground. So I just say sometime between when it's losing its leaves and before it's really growing in the spring. Yeah.
You mentioned peaches were an exception.
Yeah.
Is
Okay.
that
So yeah, we're talking
peaches and nectarines?
peaches and nectarines. I would put, I personally, I don't have much experience with nectarines because they're challenging here, but I would assume it was similar for nectarines. I can't say definitively. Peaches are a particular creature. They have this tendency to grow. Does anybody here have a peach tree that like they planted like 15 years ago and it was awesome for the first like 8 years and now it's like way too tall and kind of spindly? Anybody? Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So essentially, yeah, peaches have this tendency to not keep regenerating growth down low. They kind of develop like these woody branches and they keep pushing their new growth out. So after a while, all your new growth where your fruit is is kind of up high and you kind of have this kind of bare canopy of wood coming down. In that situation, you can't just come and dehorn the tree like this. If you chainsaw a big old peach branch, it's likely not going to resprout, which is a bummer, and you can even kill the tree. You have to cut it to a place where there's a young living whip. And so when anybody has an old peach tree, if it shoots a sprout down low, I say treat that like a miracle. You want to keep that sprout because then you can cut the branch above it and that sprout will become a branch. But if there's no sprout visible, it's hard to prune a tree, a peach tree back beyond where there's sprouts. And so with peaches, the main goal is to not let them get too tall. So keep pruning them and shaping them low so that you always have nice vegetative options to prune to in the when you're pruning it. And yeah, go ahead. Apricots and cherries, I've cut really hard and had good success. Cherries, there's a disease called bacterial canker, which is that like goopy, weepy, blobby, sappy, goopy stuff. Do you have that on your cherry? Who's got that on their cherries? Anybody? Yeah, it's not the end of the world. It's not a death sentence, but I have read that pruning more in the middle of winter can promote that more. And so if you have a tree that has a lot of bacterial canker, it can be better to summer prune or prune in late spring to avoid that disease. But I've chopped cherry trees hard and had them resprout. Yeah, again, I just encourage you, if here's where you are in your comfort level, like crank it up, be bold with everything you do, pruning and whatnot. So here, I'm gonna kind of cruise through now. This is a good time I'm just gonna kind of talk about the general categories of fruit trees and nut trees we grow in the islands, and just like keywords to remember for each type. And if you got more questions about each type, let's talk about them. So we were talking about peaches. We talked about the tendency of peaches not to be able to be rebooted pruning. So don't let them get too big. Fertilize, if you're gonna fertilize, I'd recommend fertilize any fruit tree you want to grow more. So if you have a fruit tree you want it to get bigger, fertilize it. Peaches are the one tree that I'd recommend really keeping up a fertilization program, even once they're to the size you want, because peaches are the most nitrogen hungry of fruit trees. And I really noticed that people's peaches fade. And I think that's a big part is because of nitrogen deficiency. If peaches put on big fat shots of growth, they make a lot of peaches. Once they start creeping along and slowing down, they make a lot less peaches, smaller peaches. So peaches, fertilize them like crazy. The other thing to remember about peaches is they're very fragile trees when it comes to being overloaded with fruit. Who's here had a peach like break itself with too much fruit? Anybody? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so if you have a peach tree and you have a year where it's just loaded with peaches, which happens, you have just like, it almost looks like grapes. You have so many little peaches on them. You have to thin like crazy. All fruit trees I'd recommend thinning, but peaches especially, you gotta thin with a heavy hand. Like imagine someday, by the end of summer, that's gonna be a big softball-sized peach. How many softball-sized peaches can a little brittle branch hold? So really thin like crazy. Maybe that branch can only hold one or two. So don't be afraid to thin like crazy. Asian plums, which are, like the Shiro, the Beauty, they're like the water balloon plums. My main recommendation is if you're gonna plant an Asian plum or you have an Asian plum, do a multi-graft, graft it into multiple varieties, because once you have a vigorous Asian plum, it's so too much fruit of Asian plums, because Asian plums you can't really dry. I know some people make like sauces or stuff out of them, but they're not like your true processing plum, like a Italian prune. So, they're mostly like a snack fruit. So I'd multi-graft it and I'd summer prune it once it's to the size you want, because they can become beasts. They can grow so fast. Any other, and feel free again, jump in questions as we kind of cruise through these fruit categories. Figs. First off, I'd really only recommend growing Desert King variety of fig. There are other fig varieties that do it here, and some of you in here might have some other fig variety that you love, and that's great. And if it does well, that's great. But it really, generally, it seems like Desert King is the fig that produces most readily here. I like to manage figs as bushes, not as trees, because figs bear their fruit on 1-year-old wood. So like the whip that grew this year will have the figs on it next year. And so you don't really like make heading cuts on a fig because you're cutting off your fruit potential. So I kind of let them be rangy bushes. And then when they're too tall for picking, I just do big removal cuts of whatever the big branch system is that's too tall in that bush. I chop it out in the winter. And manage for size control. And what I actually like to do with a fig at my house is I have 2 fig trees side by side. And one fig tree I'm always kind of cutting hard, and the other fig tree I'm letting go, because then I'm ensuring I have a lot of fruit on this one this year, and I'm growing this one. So I've got one that I'm bringing down and one that I'm letting fruit every year. And then I switch them. I bring that one down, I let that one fruit, I bring that one down, I let it fruit. So I like to have 2 kind of fig bushes side by side. Yeah. You don't. Yeah, figs are actually impressive plants. Figs and mulberries. Mulberries are a close relative, and mulberries do great here too, and produce. There's this one variety of mulberry we have it in our yard called Illinois everbearing. Does anybody have that mulberry tree? Nice, yeah. It produces so much fruit, and for so long. I mean, it starts in like July, and like no exaggeration, we're still eating mulberries off it. It just keeps making mulberries. And what's nice is early in the summer, the birds kind of hit it hard, but then they're on to blackberries and other things, and it just keeps cruising, making mulberries. But mulberries and figs, I don't know the botanical term for it or scientific term for it, but essentially the fig is the plant's flower. So it doesn't require any pollination to make fruit. So even if it's a rainy, miserable spring when most of your fruit trees didn't get a good pollination, figs, as long as it's a vigorous tree, will always make a good crop. Because the fruit is actually its flower. Same with mulberry. Apples, we talked about watching out for anthracnose. Yeah, go ahead. Filbert nuts, I'm getting there, but let's just jump there right now. Oh yeah, and what's your question? Big question, let's jump back to figs.
Sort of like, can I see those specific-
Sure, why not? Yeah, or yeah, half of the tree and half the tree, totally. Yeah, and figs are so forgiving. I mean, like you can come and chainsaw a fig to the ground and it will just explode with growth, and 1 year later you'll have fruit again. So I'd say just don't let it get too tall and go crazy on it. Those layers you can also dig. I'm sure you can transplant out if you want a new tree somewhere else too. Raccoons is a great question. Do you all know electro netting? You see the farmers have it for like containing sheep. That like white netting that people put out and then you electrify it. That works really well to keep raccoons out of orchards. And you can actually get electro netting that's shorter, that's like 2 feet tall, so it's easy to step over. So as long as you don't have an orchard that has like lots of maple trees hanging into it, or a fence line that, some route that a raccoon can obstacle course its way in. Before my fruit's ripe, when my fruit's getting ripe, I just go, I mow tight and I put electro netting around the orchard, and that keeps the raccoons out. So. Keeping your cats out of your fruit trees? Oh, well, it's not electro netting, it doesn't hurt an animal. It's like, it's a shock, it startles an animal. So nobody's gonna get, even, it's kind of sad, but I had like a little 2-year-old over I've got young kids, and some little 2-year-old was over who didn't know about the electric fence, and just grabbed the fence and was just like, but it like made them cry, but it didn't cause any damage. So, yeah. That said, I know there are higher charger controller, energizers, and lower energy energizers. I wouldn't buy like the hottest energizer on the market, because really a raccoon, it doesn't like it. It's a little shock. So, let's see, I'm gonna get to, I got filberts on my list here. I'll get to filberts. But we're jumping into apples. We were about anthracnose, keeping anthracnose off the young trees. Codling moth, the worm in the apple, the hole in the apple, the rotten core is an issue out here in the San Juans. Luckily, it's not catastrophic. Like talking to people who have trees down in like King County and other places, sounds like every apple is pretty ruined. Here, at least on my trees, it seems like maybe like 25% have codling moth. What's pretty effective is those little nylon codling moth stocking bags. Have you ever seen these? When the fruit's little, put this little nylon stocking bag around it, and it does keep the codling moth out. And it's labor intensive, and you don't have to do it to every apple on your tree. But like in my orchard, we have early variety apples that are more like snack varieties. I don't worry about that as much because you can just kind of eat around it and chuck it. But the ones that I want to keep for like winter storage, I'll carefully go and put at least some percentage of these baggies on the apples. So I have like some immaculate fruit that doesn't rot over the winter. Go ahead.
You ever use neem oil for caterpillars?
I've never used neem oil. I typically use BT if I'm going to spray for tent caterpillars. I mean, the easiest is just manual removal. I don't know about neem oil, whether it's effective or not, but BT is neem oil. Why neem oil is when it comes to insecticides, even organic insecticides, there's targeted insecticides like BT, which people spray for caterpillars, which only affects a caterpillar and it eats the caterpillar eats it and then it dies. It's a bacteria, so it's not affecting bees or other things. It will affect other caterpillars if they eat it, so you're probably killing other caterpillars. But neem at higher concentrations is considered, even though it's organic, is a broad spectrum insecticide. It's like a contact insecticide. So if you'd sprayed it on bees or ants or other creatures that are out and about, it's going to hurt them too. So I would just put that as a caveat. Just because something's organic doesn't mean it's not going to hurt insects. So just if you're using one of those broad spectrum, even organic insecticides, just think about like what else is out, what are the pros and cons of using it. So yeah, manual control is great for tent caterpillars, and if it's a big old heritage apple that there's no way you could prune them out or get them out, then I would say BT is what I prefer. Cherries. So in my experience, either you net them or they're an ornamental because the birds eat them all. I don't know if that's your experience. Some years, oh, I got my cherries this year, but most years, is this your experience with cherries that the birds eat them all? Yeah. So how I do cherries in my house is are you familiar with that term, espalier? Where you like grow it in a fan. I espalier my cherries and prune them several times a summer to keep them size control. So when they're in this nice wall, it's easy to net. If you have a giant cherry tree growing in your orchard, it's pretty hard to net. When I talk to people with all fruits, berries or cherries, I say plan your netting strategy first and then plant accordingly. It's hard to net established plants that are all planted in a creative way. So, if you're really serious about eating your berries and your cherries, I would say come up with your net strategy and then plant within that net strategy. Pears are great. They're tough, relatively disease resistant out here. There's some funky things that affect their leaves, like that orange spot and whatnot, but they're pretty darn tough. They're easy to grow. The main thing you want to do with pears, my only keyword here is pick before they get soft on the tree. So, pick them while they're still firm, and then they let them soften on your counter. If you pick them when they're soft, they're often mushy and gross inside. Italian prunes, another slam dunk tree for the San Juan County. They're easy to grow, super disease resistant. Black knot affects them, but you can prune black knot out, and they're an amazing, you can dry them, you can can them, you can sauce them. I love Italian prunes. Hazelnuts and filberts. On Orcas Island, they're only ornamental because the stellar jays eat them all. What about Lopez? Do you guys have stellar jays? No stellar jays? This is the weirdest thing in the world. San Juan Island, no stellar jays. Waldron Island, no stellar jays. Orcas Island, stellar jays, and they eat every hazelnut. So if you don't have them, that's amazing. Grow hazelnuts, they're easy to grow. If you have stellar jays, treat them as an ornamental. And they're a beautiful ornamental because they get the catkins in the spring or in the winter, and that you can coppice hazelnuts, which is where you chop them to the ground and they'll resprout. And Walnuts. My recommendation with walnuts is plant them in an open area where when they're big, you can put a metal collar on their trunk so squirrels can't climb them. If squirrels can jump into the tree from an adjacent tree, the squirrels are gonna eat most of your walnuts. Walnuts are tough because squirrels go for them while they're still immature in their husk. So they're beating you to them. It's not like if you're like stay up on harvesting, you're gonna beat the squirrels. Squirrels are getting them first. Typically when they hit the ground. Yeah, the husk splits open. Well, unfortunately, it's not a race, it's a losing race because the squirrels are picking them before they fall to the ground. Which segues us into my favorite nut tree, chestnuts, which are an amazing tree to grow here. They're super productive. Roasted chestnuts are delicious. I used to run a chestnut nursery. And yeah, they're amazing. And actually right now at our house, we're picking tons of chestnuts off. They start producing when they're young. And what is nice is it is a race you can race against squirrels because chestnuts come in a really spiky husk. And often that spiky husk falls to the ground, but that husk doesn't open until they're ripe. And so the squirrels can't get them immature or crows or whatever be hassling them from. So that husk defends them until they're ripe. So you can shake the tree and pick up nuts every day, and you can beat the squirrels and you can beat the crows to your nuts. There's a couple varieties that do well here. The key with chestnuts is they need drainage. They can't have wet feet. So if you have a really wet field or orchard, they're gonna have a hard time or die. So they need to be in a relatively well-drained spot. I know in Lopez, you have a lot of like sandy glacial till kind of soils here. So it's probably a lot of great soil on Lopez for chestnuts. So drainage. And then the other thing to know about them is they're wind pollinated. They're not insect pollinated. I mean, insects come to them, but their main source of pollen dispersal is the wind. And so you have to think about them like you think about corn. You know, when you plant corn, you can't just have a corn plant here and a corn plant there. It won't pollinate. So you gotta plant them like a grove. And so there's two ways to do this. One is you either take the space and plant like 9 chestnuts and take up, put them at 30-foot spacing and have what would that be? 3x3, so that'd be a 90 by 90, well, bigger, like 120 by 120 area dedicated to chestnuts and have a grove of them. Or what I did at my house is I planted 3 chestnuts together, 3 that I knew were a good pollination trio, and I planted them like 3 feet apart, 1, 2, 3. And I'm kind of growing them as a single tree. So I'm pruning them such that one doesn't like dominate the other 2. And I'm kind of growing it as a 3-trunk tree. And it's pollinating itself great. And I'm getting, even off this tree I planted, 8 years ago, it's probably 20 feet tall. And we get like a 5-gallon bucket of chestnuts off it, which is a lot of chestnuts. And chestnuts are delicious. They store well in the fridge. Yeah, they're just an awesome nut. They're really tough once they're established. They're drought tolerant. They grow fast. Yeah.
The theory of making some of your apple fruit give it back tree for offering.
I don't know about that theory, but I like that theory. Yeah. Next question. Yeah.
Big wall.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
My biggest problem is, this husk.
Oh, the husk fly. Yeah.
Some years it's worse than others.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, the same thing on orchids, unfortunately. Yeah, that is this fly that stings it. It's kind of related to codling moth. It stings the husk and it turns into that kind of black goopy. So instead of the walnut falling and splitting and getting your perfect little walnut out, it's this mess that you gotta clean, and it's a major bummer. And unfortunately, if we were in Eastern Oregon and you were big ag, you could have a whole spray regime monitoring, spraying and whatnot. But for the home orchardists, there's not really anything you can do about that fly other than just hope some years are better than others and wear rubber gloves when you are dealing with it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, those are gonna hatch into I don't know intimately, but yeah, those are becoming I mean, you could, I don't know if like killing those worms would do anything appreciable. I mean, I know I have a client who has some big old walnuts and we went down the rabbit hole, of what could we do about that fly? And we kind of came to a point of just like, there's nothing we can really do. Yeah, without like major chemical intervention.
Yeah, gypsy moth.
Gypsy moth, what do you mean by a gypsy moth?
Gypsy moth.
Moth, is that the one? Okay, I don't know this insect. I know spotted winged Drosophila is an issue on soft fruits, cherries and berries and whatnot. And in my experience, it kind of seems to ebb and flow on that. So are people experiencing spotted winged Drosophila here? They were kind of predicting it to be this like doom. I know down in South Sound, it's worse, but
It's great, the whole thing.
yeah, gypsy moths, yeah. Yeah, well, I don't know about that one. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I feel like I've heard that too. In that case, I would, is it affecting the fruit production? Okay. Yeah, like, when I see lichen on fruit trees, sometimes it doesn't seem to really affect it. So if it's not, if your tree's still fruiting, I'd say it's just pretty. Yeah,
My sister said that beard's, moss only grows where the air is the purest.
okay, well, that's good to know. We got pure air here.
I think we have time for one more
Yeah,
question,
let's
and then
do
we
it.
gotta let James go to the
Yeah,
fair.
unfortunately, I gotta run to the ferry.
He's been here since 7 or so, and if he doesn't catch this ferry, he won't be home till 5.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, so if you have any other, we'll take one more question, and
Oh,
then
yeah.
he has his email.
Yeah, you can email me questions.
Have you get cabbage that day?
Varietal, it's called the Megaton. And it makes amazing sauerkraut, but also lots of compost, irrigation, fertilizer, all the stuff you do for your garden, but it's a varietal, Megaton.
James, thank you.
Sure
so much.
thing, yeah, nice to see you all.